So this time we're going to be looking at Chapter 5, Lesson 2. And Chapter 5, Lesson 2 is going to continue on with this whole study of genetics and how this heredity and how our traits are passed from parents to offspring and make predictions about all of that. So the first thing we need to mention is what a chromosome is. Now, remember in Chapter 3 and 4, we talked a lot about chromosomes when we talked about the mitosis and meiosis stuff. So a chromosome is a thread-like structure in the nucleus of the cell. And the chromosomes are going to be the thing that contains the genetic information that controls all of your traits. So your genetic information, your genes, all of that stuff that makes you who you are is carried on your chromosomes. Genes are a section of a chromosome, so a little piece of chromosome. And each gene is going to have genetic information for one trait. Now, this is where things get a little bit confusing because we call the different forms of a gene alleles. So they're like the options. So like purple alleles or white alleles. So that would be what an allele is. It's just the different form of a gene or the options for the genes that we have. So here is a picture to kind of help you figure out remember what a chromosome is. So remember, chromosomes are have this kind of X shape to them. So a little section of a chromosome is a gene. Now, when we're talking about all of this genetic stuff, and we're talking about Punnett squares and what things look like and based on the, what traits they have based on the genes they have and whatnot, we have two terms that we have to get really familiar with. The first one is the phenotype. So the phenotype is the organism's appearance or what it looks like. One of the ways I remember is I always remember that phenotype is the face. So they both start with a f sound, that F sound. So your face is what you look like. So phenotype, face. So phenotype is what it looks like. So the organism's appearance. So that'll be things like purple flowers or white flowers or brown hair or blue eyes or tall or short or something like that. So it's what the organism's appearance is. Phenotype is based on the genotype. And the genotype are the inherited alleles together, or the genes. So if you remember, genotype, genes. When we're talking about genotypes, there are a couple of things we have to remember too. So the first one is the word homozygous. So if something is homozygous, that means both of the alleles are the same. So homo means same, okay? So if you remember, homo means same. So both alleles then are the same when we're talking about homozygous. Now what that means is that when we're writing them out or looking at them, we're saying that they're either both dominant alleles or they're both recessive alleles. So they're both capital letters or they're both lowercase letters. Heterozygous alleles are different. Now, when we say that they're different, we don't mean that they are like a different letter. What we mean is that one is big, one is little. Or so we've got one capital, one lowercase. Hetero means different. So homo is same, hetero is different. So homozygous would be big R, or little b, or something like that. Heterozygous is like big R, big B, little b. So do you guys see what I mean by this whole alleles are the same? So these are both big R's. These are both little b's. Heterozygous, they're different. So we've got a capital and a lowercase for each of those examples. So If you have a big B or a big B little b, you're going to show the dominant phenotype, okay? If you have a little b or a little r or whatever, you're going to have the recessive phenotype. So remember we were talking about dominant and purple being dominant and recessive being white back here when we talked about those characteristics and I told you to bookmark that page. So these are dominants, these are recessives. To be dominant, you have to have a capital letter in there. The only way the recessive phenotype will show up is if they are both lowercase letters, okay? So anytime there's a capital letter involved in the genotype, then you know the phenotype is dominant. The only way to get a recessive phenotype is by having 2 lowercase letters for your genotype. I know that's really confusing, but we are going to do a lot of practice with that over the next couple days to make sure that you guys really understand phenotypes and genotypes and dominant and recessive, okay? All right, so let's just kind of run through some of these real quick. So plant height, big R, big R. So what is it going to look like? So remember, we've got the big R tells us what? Okay, that it's dominant, right? So big R tells us it's dominant. Plant height, the dominant trait or the dominant phenotype for plant height is going to be tall. So based on that, big R, we're going to have a tall plant. So if we have flower color that we're representing with a little r, remember little r is going to be recessive. So flower color, the recessive is white. So our phenotype, based on this genotype, the phenotype for flower color would be white. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky. This genotype is a big R, a little r. So remember that's heterozygous. So big R, little r, heterozygous. Pod shape. So we're looking for the dominant because we've got one capital there. So we know that as long as we have a capital, the phenotype will be dominant, right? So the dominant phenotype for pod shape is smooth pods. I'll let you go ahead and figure out those other 4 on your own if you choose to. Okay, so then now let's look at these genotypes. If we have something that is a homozygous green pod, well, homo tells us that it's the same, right? So we know that it's going to be either 2 capitals or 2 lowercase letters. Green is dominant, so green pods are dominant, so our genotype are going to be 2 capital letters, so big R, big R. For this one, we have a heterozygous yellow seed. Well, we know that heterozygous means that they are different, right? So for a heterozygous yellow seed, we're going to have a capital and a lowercase for our genotype because they're different. They're heterozygous. So we've got a big R, little r. For this one, we have a homozygous short plant. Again, we know homozygous tells us that they're going to be the same. So they're either going to both be capital letters or both lowercase letters, right? Short tells us that it's recessive. So our genotype then for a homozygous short plant is going to be little r, little r. And I'll let you go ahead and practice those other ones on your own. Again, we're going to be doing a lot of work with these, so it shouldn't be too confusing. All right, so this brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, and that would be a Punnett square. Punnett squares are models that are used to predict possible genotypes and phenotypes of offspring. So they can tell you if you cross 2 certain kinds of things, what kind of offspring to expect. Okay? So in this situation, we have a homozygous purple flower, and we're going to cross it with a homozygous white flower. So homozygous purple, remember, is going to be, homo means same, purple was dominant, so that's going to be a big R, right? Homozygous white flower, homo again tells us the same, white tells us recessive, so that's going to be our little r, little r. Now, we take this big R, and put them here. We take this little r, and we put them here. Now, the reason I've got them color-coded is just to help you see how these letters go into your Punnett square, okay? You don't normally color-code them. All right, so we've set up our Punnett square. We've got our big R set up so that it's here. We've got our little r set up so that it's here, right? So this R can go here or it can go here. So it can only go across the rows, the row that it's in. Same thing with this one. This big R can go here or it can go here. Again, it can only go in the row that it's in. This little r is going to go in this column, so it's going to go here and it's going to go here. And then this little r is going to go here and it's going to go here, so only in its column. So now when we write our genotype, we're going to say, okay, our genotype is big R, little r. And what are those things going to look like? Well, big R, little r is going to be dominant, right? So the dominant trait is going to be purple flower. So that would be our phenotype. So Punnett squares are pretty easy. You guys are going to get to practice a lot with Punnett squares also, so don't worry, you'll be Punnett square experts by the time you're done. And we will be practicing all of those in class. We'll practice this in class so you don't have to worry about it right now, okay? All right, so that leads us to the next part that we have to talk about. And that would be the probability of getting that cross. Because now, if we go back here, what this is saying is that if we have this parent crossed with this parent, all of the offspring are going to be like this. So this is the only possibility for our genotype, is this big R, little r. That's the only thing that we can get from this cross, which means the only color flowers we're going to get are purple flowers from crossing a purple flower and a white flower that look like, have these genotypes. Okay? So with the probability, what we're trying to figure out is what is that mathematical chance that something will happen? Or what is the mathematical chance that we are going to get purple flowers or tall plants or something like that? Usually we're going to write probability as a fraction or a percentage. For our purposes, we're going to pretty much always in this class, I'm always going to have you write them as a percentage, okay? Because it's going to be really helpful to you when you start looking at Punnett squares and you can break your square into 25, 25, 25, and 25. But I'll show you that in a couple seconds. So that probability is written as a percentage. It's the mathematical chance that something's going to happen. We find this by writing the number of times something happens over the number of chances there were for it to happen. I know that sounds really, really confusing, right? So it's the number of times something happened over the number of chances there were for it to happen. So for example, let's pretend that we tossed a coin 20 times, okay? 10 times it landed on heads. So if we wanted to calculate the probability of our next toss being heads, we would say, okay, we tossed it 20 times, 10 times we got heads. So the number of times something happened would be 10. So we've got the 10 here. How many chances were there for it to happen? Well, we tossed it 20 times, so it would be 20. So our probability is going to be 10 over 20, or 1/2, or 50%. So we're going to go back and look at the probability for this example right here. So what was the probability of us getting a big R, little r for our genotype? Well, we can say, okay, we've got 4, because it happened 4 times, right? Out of how many chances was there for it to happen? Well, there was 4. So 4 out of 4, or 100%. Another way to look at this is to say, okay, each square is 25%. So this is 25, 25, 25, 25. So 25 plus 25, 50, plus 25 is 75, plus 25 is 100%. So then what was our probability of getting a purple flower? Well, that was the only option we had, so that would be 100% also. So the probability of getting a purple flower from this cross is 100%. Again, you're going to be practicing these probabilities quite a bit with your Punnett squares, so you will have a lot of time to work on these. All right, so the next thing we have to kind of hit is, what is a pedigree? Now, a pedigree is a model that traces a trait through generations of a family. So it's kind of like a family tree. So it follows a trait through a family. So we're going to kind of talk about what a pedigree is going to look like. So this is what a pedigree kind of looks like, okay? Circles represent women, squares represent men. If there is a line between them like this, that means that there was a cross there of some sort, okay? A line coming down like this from the middle of the cross is showing offspring. So I've got this set up to trace traits through my family. So if I wanted to figure out, let's see, what trait could I follow? Curly hair. Let's do curly hair in my family. So we are going to look at curly hair in my family, okay? My grandpa had curly hair. So since he has the trait, we're going to color in his square. And you're just going to have to bear with me because I can't color this in very well on my computer. My grandma does not have curly hair. However, she is a carrier for curly hair. So because she's a carrier of that trait, she is going to be half colored in. So carriers are half colored in. People who have the trait are completely colored in. So this is my mom's side of the family. My uncle has curly hair. So he's getting half of his square from my grandpa and half of his square from my grandma. So he gets half of it has to be colored in because grandpa can only give him a colored in side. Grandma gives him her colored in side, but she could have given him her other side. Now, remember, grandpa can only give colored in, so this is my aunt. So that's what she gets from my grandpa. But guess what? She has curly hair too. So she got the curly one from my grandma also. My mom does not have curly hair, but remember, my grandpa only has a curly hair gene to give. So she is a carrier, like her mom. Now, my other side of the family, my grandpa has 0 curly hair. My grandma had curly hair. So she gets a colored in circle. Okay, so my aunt has to be a carrier even though she doesn't have curly hair. So she is a carrier of curly hair. My uncle is a carrier. Because remember now, Grandpa only has an empty half to give. Grandma has a colored in half to give. My other uncle also is a carrier. And my dad is a carrier. So now if you look at this, my sister and I, we could either end up being carriers because we could get a colored in half from one parent and a not colored in half from the other, or we could get 2 not colored in halves, or we could get 2 completely colored in halves. Well, what happened is I'm going to guess based on my own kids that I am not a carrier because I have stick straight hair. My kids both have pretty straight hair. My sister, on the other hand, her kid, actually she doesn't have her, she's not, hasn't had her baby yet, so we don't really know. But so we're just going to leave her blank right now too because she does not have curly hair either. So we're going to say that neither one of us are carriers. Okay? So this is what a pedigree looks like. Now, on your test, I won't make you fill in a pedigree. I'm just going to probably show you a picture of a pedigree and ask you what it means and what it's representing. You know, what is a pedigree? So I might ask you if it's completely colored in, what does that mean? Or if it's half colored in, what does that mean? Or if it's empty, what does that mean? That's as far as I'm going to ask you about a pedigree. I'm not going to make you build a pedigree for your test, okay? Okay, so that brings us to the next little pieces that we have to cover. Because now Mendel's genetics and his studies of heredity all come out sounding real simple, real easy, and it just unfortunately isn't quite always so simple and clear-cut and easy. Because there are some things that are called complex inheritance patterns. So some of these things don't follow those rules that Mendel came up with. So the first are types of dominance. So basically, not all allele pairs have this dominant recessive interaction that we've been looking at. Sometimes there's a blend, sometimes they both show up. It just kind of depends on what we're dealing with. So there's 2 types of these dominance recessive interactions. So the first one is called incomplete dominance. So incomplete dominance happens when the offspring's phenotype is a combination of the parent's phenotype. So you can see over here in this picture, we've got red snapdragons and white snapdragons that are crossed. So here's the red snapdragon, the white snapdragon. They're crossed. So they end up with a big R, little r, right, as their genotype. But their phenotype then is pink. So it's a combination of the two parents' phenotypes. So that's incomplete dominance. Neither one is completely dominant over the other. They end up with being a blend. The next one is called codominance. So what happens in codominance is that both alleles can be observed in the phenotype. So neither one, again, is dominant over the other one. So for example, here we have a pure red cow crossed with a pure white cow, okay? So the cow is going to inherit one white hair allele from one parent, one red hair allele from the other, and the offspring then will have both red and white hair. So it's a roan, is what we call that. So one parent was pure red, one parent was pure white. The offspring end up having both red and white alleles and showing that both of those in their phenotype. Okay, another thing besides the type of dominance is multiple alleles. Some genes have more than 2 alleles. A really good example of this would be human blood type. So the alleles for human blood type are A, B, and O. So there are 3 alleles rather than just 2. Remember, an allele is an option, right? So we have A, B, and O. There are 3 options for the alleles rather than just 2. The third one is polygenic inheritance. So multiple genes, that's what polygenic is just telling you, many genes. So polygenic inheritance is when multiple genes determine the phenotype of a trait. So it's not just determined by one gene. You've got lots of genes or more than one gene involved in deciding what the phenotype is. An example of that would be eye color in humans. We like to pretend that it's as simple as blue being recessive, brown being dominant, but that's not the case. There's lots more than one, we have multiple genes that decide what color eyes we have. So those are those 3 different kinds of complex inheritance patterns. Okay, sometimes the environment can also affect a phenotype. So it's not always just based on the genetics. For example, acidic soil makes a blue hydrangea flower, while basic soil makes pink hydrangea flowers. So depending on what the soil composition is, will decide what color the flowers are. So it's all based on the environment rather than the genetics. Another example would be human health choices affecting your phenotype. So if you choose to be a couch potato and eat lots and lots and lots of food and never get any exercise, it's not going to matter what your parents were like or what kind of genetics you have, because your phenotype is going to be based on your choices that you made. And that is going to end our Chapter 5, Section 2.